welcome to week 3 of the popular Gothic novel course. In this week, I'm going to talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. In particular, I'm going to talk about the Gothic context which led to the writing of this fantastic Gothic fiction. Mary Shelley was born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and she was the daughter of the radical philosopher William Godwin, who described her as singularly bold, which means, uniquely bold. She was extraordinary in some respects, and somewhat of an imperious and active mind. She had an independent mind, which was had its own mechanisms for thinking through things, and she was very, very active and agile with regard to rational thinking. She was the daughter, as I mentioned, of William Godwin, and William Godwin was very famous in that period, and he was a social philosopher, a political journalist, and a religious dissenter. So you can see the singularity of Mary Shelley and its origins in the father figure. And he anticipated the English Romantic literary movement. So she had a fantastic parents who were very well read, who were independent thinkers, who were dissenters. As you can see, he was a religious dissenter, and so you can see the kind of influences on Mary Shelley. And we also know, if we read Mary Shelley's biography, that the father was very, very influential, and that he encouraged Mary's avid reading. So she had a lot of very, very influential impact on her from a very, very early age. Let's look at her mother. Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was the one who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was a groundbreaking, a radical text of literature, which can be classified as one of the first feminist texts, one of the first texts which also talked about human rights issues of the female gender. So you can see what kind of mother she had, and unfortunately her mother died days after her birth, and these two figures, the mother and the father, were well-known writers of the day, very, very influential and independent-minded figures. And now let's look at the husband, who was Percy Shelley. So Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin married Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Shelley praised the irresistible wildness and sublimity of her feelings. So you can see the kind of similarity of judgment in some ways. While Percy Shelley calls her character wild, irresistibly wild, and you can see the father calling her singularly bold. So you can see her as a woman who had a very, very fierce streak of mind, a very active and fierce streak of mind, which Percy found irresistible. And Mary Shelley and Percy married in December 1816. So the context is there for you on the slide, and the sublimity of her feelings is also very interesting. The way Percy describes her feelings as sublime, as provoking some kind of awe on the person in front of her. So we see a character being sketched very interestingly by all these figures who knew her very closely, and the idea of wildness, the idea of singularity, and the intensity of feelings all emerge when we want to think about Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. Now, we have the title page of Frankenstein, or the Modern Prometheus, which was published in 1818, and there is a reference to Paradise Lost. on the title page. Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to make me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? So you can see the voice which is rebelling, which is questioning the maker on the title page. So it's a very unique text, and what gave birth to this text is going to be the subject of this lecture today. So a ghostwriting contest on a stormy June night in 1816 inspired Frankenstein, and which is often called the first true work of science fiction as well. So there are two things in this quotation that I've mentioned on the slide. One is a ghostwriting contest, and the other is science fiction. So two labels immediately come to mind when we think about Frankenstein. One is Gothic, the other is science fiction, and it emerged. So there is a kind of a collapse of these two labels with regard to this narrative, and this narrative was born out of a writing contest. So let's see who kind of initiated it, what happened, where, when. So Mary Shelley composed Frankenstein in 1816 at Lake Geneva, where she was staying with Lord Byron, John Polidori, Byron's physician, Claire Claremont, who is Shelley's half-sister, and Percy Bysshe Shelley. So they're all staying together at Lake Geneva, and it was at this setting in 1816 that Frankenstein was apparently composed. So this is another contemporary image, a 19th century image of that Villa Diodati where they stayed, and this is also a contemporary image, contemporary as in now, and this one is 19th century. So it is in this villa, Byron, Mary, and Percy Shelley, Claire Claremont, and Polidori told each other ghost stories to pass the time in 1816, and one of the stories, that was written out of this contest was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. We also know that Polidori's Dracula was also the product of this kind of ghostwriting contest. So they kind of spend, this group of literati, these literary figures, Byron and Shelley, they pass the time by telling each other ghost stories. And one evening, a horror poem was read out, and let's see what that poem is. So Byron read some verses from Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Christabel, a Gothic poem in which the character Geraldine, who appears as a woman but is actually a lamia or disguised serpent, seeks both the spiritual and physical possession of the beautiful and innocent Christabel. So the context for this poem is that a disguised serpent is trying to possess a very innocent, beautiful young woman, Christabel, and Percy Shelley was clearly affected by the claustrophobic environment. They all crowded together in that villa Diodati, and the hypnotic power of Byron's reading of the poem kind of made him to flee the room screaming, apparently horrified. So that was the environment, the atmosphere in which all these figures took inspiration for their own works. So it is apparently Lord Byron who kind of throws the gauntlet. He is the one who, initiates this competition, the ghost writing competition, ghost stories writing competition, and he is the one who apparently gave the vital spark that gave the novel Frankenstein, its origin. And it was his suggestion on one evening at Villa Diodati, as the candlelight flickered within the house and lightning flashed across the surface of the lake outside, that those present should turn their hands to the writing of ghost stories. So what is very clear is that this is not Great Britain. they're holidaying, and it is apparently a very, very weird summer in which lots of catastrophe is happening, in several places, and there's a lightning, natural elements are not being very friendly, and they are passing the time. These friends are passing the time telling each other supernatural stories, and at this moment, on one evening, one bizarre evening, Byron says, let's all write stories, ghost stories, to pass the time. So the land is foreign. The atmosphere is in its extreme in terms of the natural elements. So all these elements in themselves kind of create an effect on the people who are already telling each other literary supernatural narratives to pass the time. And in this heady cauldron of feelings and impacts and effects, Frankenstein, the novel, is born. Let us now look at some of the associated topics which were discussed in that Villa Diodati among these friends. And once again, the context or the atmosphere is important, because there's thunder and lightning rolling down from the mountains across the lake. So nature is in its really wild mood. Wildness is something that we need to kind of hang on to when we want to think about the origin of the novel Frankenstein. So the candlelit interior of the Villa Diodati became the home to discussions of not only Gothic narratives, but also to subjects such as Galvanism and the principles of animation bringing life back to inanimate things. With Polidori's medical knowledge, so we should remember Polidori is Byron's physician, and he brings the medical knowledge to the table, and there is a science which is balancing out the most speculative imaginations of Byron and Shelley. So they're talking about literary narratives of Gothic texts. They're talking about Galvanism. They're talking about animation, bringing life back to the dead. So these topics are related to one another, even though there is science on the one side and supernatural subjects on the other, spiritual stuff on the other. So you can think about these discussions as the atmosphere, as the Gothic context for Frankenstein. Now let's see what Mary Shelley herself had to say about this kind of environment. And she says, this is Mary Shelley's own words, and she says, I quote, "Many a long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, to which I was a devout but nearly silent listener." So she is kind of listening to the conversation between Shelley and Byron quietly, and she is absorbing the subjects which are being talked about. And during one of these, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others, the nature of the principle of life. The nature of life itself was also talked about, and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated. The idea of how to make life, how to create life, that principle is also being talked about, and how could it possibly be discovered, and how could that message be communicated, that discovery be passed on. So these are some of the subjects that they are talking about, and we know, because we have read Frankenstein, we know that all these topics are also being literary, also all these topics are being also discussed in the novel, that how that spark of life can be and did kind of was discovered, and all these are put into practice by the central character Frankenstein in his creation of the monster. So you can see where Mary Shelley could have drawn on with respect to those literary discourse of the principle of life, the spark for this discourse of life could have gone back to these discussions. And they talked of the experiments of Dr. Darwin. They means Byron and Shelley. They talked of the experiments of Dr. Darwin, and who apparently preserved a piece of vermicelli in a glass case till by some extraordinary means it began to move with voluntary motion. So it kind of took on a life of its own, and there is motion in that vermicelli, in that piece of vermicelli. So you can see how interested people then were about how to create life, how to kind of act as God, which Frankenstein does. And you can see in the connection to the quotation from Paradise Lost, where God is being questioned and asked, "Did I ask thee to make me? Did I ask you to create me?" So all these questions, the idea of creation is kind of discussed in this literary text, Gothic narrative of Frankenstein. 1816, the year in which these friends holiday in Lake Geneva, where they spend their time in Villa Diodati, is known as the year without a summer, because it was, as I said, in terms of its weather, it was really bizarre, and there are dreadful incidents, apparently volcanoes erupting in Indonesia. So in terms of the climate, it is really unsettling. It's macabre, and that year, that summer, became the perfect backdrop to the telling of bleak and doom-laden Gothic tales. So there is an external stimulus that idea seems to be reinforced when we look at the narrative surrounding the origin of Frankenstein. So by now, we are very clear about the sources of Mary's imagination that produced Frankenstein. One is Galvanism. The other is the idea of the spark of life and how it could animate things. And plus, there is this thunderstorms going outside, and there's candlelight within Villa Diodati. So these are some of the external influences on Mary's imagination. So all these took deep root in Mary's imagination and found its way into Frankenstein. So we need to talk a little bit more about Galvanism, because that idea is keeping on recurring in conversations around the Gothic context of Frankenstein. So what is Galvanism and what is the story? So Shelley was inspired by the concept of galvanism, the idea that scientists could use electricity to stimulate or restart life. And where did we get this name galvanism from? So it is named after Luigi Galvani, an Italian doctor, and the concept was put together after Galvani was able to make a frog's legs twitch when he hooked the animal up to an electric charge. So the idea of giving electricity and bringing life back to the dead is associated with this notion of galvanism. So electricity was a new and barely understood force when Galvani performed his experiments on dissected animals during the late 18th century. So this discussion of galvanism on the part of Shelley and Byron, and we had the physician Polidori as well in 1816 with them. So all these kind of scientific and pseudoscientific concepts had a deep influence on Mary Shelley. And this is important because we know that Frankenstein put this monster together from disparate body parts. So the idea of putting together things and stitching it back and giving it life is a very, very interesting concept, and it is connected to the subjects such as these, galvanism and animation, which were being kind of hotly discussed during the 18th century, during the end of the 18th century. There was a Dr. Darwin mentioned early on, and we need to remember that was Erasmus Darwin, not Charles Darwin. It was Dr. Erasmus Darwin, grandfather of Charles Darwin, and he is the medical. He was also a very famous medical doctor, a renowned botanist and herbalist, and he gave a lot of lectures on anatomy in the cellar of his own home. Uh, the topics of interest with regard to anatomy was also important to Shelley, Mary Shelley. Now, we've talked about Velo Diodati, we've talked about galvanism, animation. We've talked about the weather, the really wild weather during during 1816, the year without a summer. So we've talked about all these connected ideas. We also need to think about graveyards, the image and the narrative surrounding graveyards in the late 18th century would also have had a great influence on Mary Shelley for these reasons. Because Mary Shelley grew up during the era of the body snatchers. In other words, bodies where, in fact, there were not enough dead bodies of murderers available for doctors, for medical students. And so what they had to do was the doctors had to pay gangs of body snatchers, and they would dig up the freshly buried dead and hand it over to the doctors, the medical students, for a payment. So that's how the students got sufficient bodies in order for them to do the examination, dissection, and learn about the human anatomy. The graveyard is also a very important setting for Mary and Percy Shelley, because when they had been courting, they apparently often met up in the churchyard of the old St. Pancras, which served a large parish, and many dead were buried there. So this was a graveyard which was comparatively lonely, and it had a local reputation as a favorite place for body snatchers. So Mary Shelley would have known this because she had grown up in close vicinity to this particular churchyard. So the idea of body snatching, the idea of murderous bodies being found dismembered, the idea of stealing bodies and selling them to doctors for medical experiments, all these are important elements which would have fed Mary Shelley's imagination, and all of this would have contributed to the structuring of her very, very radical Gothic tale, Frankenstein. Now, we realize that this casual ploy, the game of writing Gothic short stories, resulted in two very significant texts. One is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The other is Polydori's The Vampire, a tale which influenced Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. Frankenstein is a story of a man's transgression, and it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of science, as well as it's a cautionary tale which kind of asks an individual to take responsibility for his or her actions. So it's a very interesting tale with multiple purposes embedded in it. And I have an image of the manuscript draft of Frankenstein, and on the margins we can see Shelley's comments. Apparently it is believed that Shelley Shelley had kind of had an influence of about 4,000 words in this novel. And Shelley is the husband, Percy Shelley. So he is supposed to have kind of changed about 4,000 words in this capacious novel. There's a minor influence. Mary Shelley, what did she say about the origins of her work, Frankenstein? She says, I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to this task. So she wanted to compete really seriously, and produce a story that would kind of strike dread into the heart of the person who's reading it. So she says one which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror, one to make the reader dread to look around, to curdle the blood and quicken the beatings of the heart. So she did want to kind of provoke a particular set of emotions on the part of the reader through this text. And she says that this text would kind of speak to the mysterious fears of our nature, something mysterious about which we used to kind of be frightened about. And she also desired to kind of provoke horror in the minds of the reader, something that would really curdle the blood, and create spine-tingling moments on the reader, and quicken the pace of the heart. So she really was, after producing a really macabre, really scary Gothic text, and so she had the Gothic genre in her mind when she was thinking about the structure and contents of the story. Perfect Gothic tale, if we think about this as the intention of the writer. And the idea of fear, the word mysterious is very important, because one of the purposes of Gothic fiction is to kind of provoke fear. It's very basic, intention on the part of the Gothic text, and that fear is a primitive fear which is in everybody. So it would address that notion which is in the heart of every reader. So it's a very popular kind of text because of this, because every individual is capable of being scared, because fear is a primitive quality, and Mary Shelley is trying to reach that kind of primitive spark in every human being. And all these talks that this group had been having, if we kind of think about it, the idea of Galvanism, animation, Gothic poetry, such as Christabel being read by Byron, which apparently scared Shelley, and all this ghostwriting competition, all these talks about the principle of life and how to bring it back. All these talks at the Villa Diodati continued as the weather outside remained stormy, and it was following one of these conversations that Mary had the nightmare that gave rise to the central idea of Frankenstein. So there was a particular moment during the stay which led to the creation of Frankenstein, because she kind of has a dream about an incident, a key incident in the novel, and the nightmare itself is created because of all these external incidents, including the stormy, wild weather, as well as the wild subjects that are being discussed. So there's a symbolic as well as a literal manifestation of the wild in those days leading up to the writing of Frankenstein. And this quotation is by Mary herself, Mary Shelley, and she wrote this in the 1831 preface to the book. And let's see what she has to say. Night waned upon this talk. It's very literary. If you look at this passage, it has a lot of dosage of the literary. Night waned upon this talk. Waned is an interesting word. Waning and waxing. It's like the moon. Night waned upon this talk, and even the witching hour had gone by before we retired to rest. So they go to bed really late. When I placed my head on my pillow, I did not sleep, nor could I be said to think. My imagination, unbidden, possessed and guided me, gifting the successive images that arose in my mind with a vividness far beyond the usual bounds of reverie. I saw with shut eyes but acute mental vision. I saw the pale student of the unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. So this is the nightmare. This is the nightmare. The scene that comes to her mind is that, the hideous image of a man stretched out and on the working of some powerful engine showing signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. So she kind of dreams that really key moment of the dead coming back to life, of a body being kind of given that principle of life, that spark of life, and we have a reference to the student, the medical student as well, who is kind of kneeling by that thing which is going to get life from the hands of the student. So this is being dreamt by Mary, and this is born out of her imagination, which is kind of giving her a very clear, vivid picture, and we know what led to this kind of nightmare, and you can see how the story seems to kind of come into the mind of Mary Shelley. It's born out of instinct. It comes deep within the recesses of the human mind. So the birth of the story is not any kind of rational, not due to any kind of rational process, but it is born out of this cauldron of imagination, which over which the writer apparently doesn't seem to have any control. So this imagination comes unbidden, without any seeking of it on the writer's part, on Mary's part, and it possesses her. So the spark of creativity is kind of a spirit which possesses the writer. Thank you for watching. I'll continue in the next session.